Throughout this video, I'm going to be going over a textbook that I read for my Business 200 course, section 1700. I'm going to be going over this textbook by Lee G. Bowman and Terrence E. Deal. It's called Reframing Organizations. So the first two chapters, as previously stated in my other video, it goes over the understanding of organizations and developing and redeveloping organizations or institutions. So it broadly goes over the four frames, which I go into detail about. The first two frames, the structural frame and the human resource frame, in my previous video. So if you haven't watched it, I would go back and watch it, just so that you could understand furthermore what I'm going to go over throughout this video. So in this video, I'm going to be going over the other two frames, the political frame and the symbolic frame. After completing this, I will be presenting another video on improving leadership practices, so stay tuned for that one. The third frame of the text is the political frame. The political frame is also described as jungles as a metaphor. As one would think about a jungle, you would think about how chaotic it is, and survival. What are the resources that you would need in order to survive, prey versus predator, and how you would utilize different relationships within different groups, creating allyships in order to survive. So it's kind of the same idea as working with politics and playing the political games that come with being in an institution and framing and reframing. So politics is described as the heart of determining actions. Resources are allocated according to the organization's interests and welfare. So one of the key things is interdependence. Just having allyships and members that are aware of their role in performing for the organization's main objective within that political space. So I'm going to be going over chapter 9, which has to do with power, conflict, and coalition. So the way that different group dynamics have different advantages and how it can become dysfunctional, but how people leverage their own resources and their own skill sets, and also how people form bonds, even within that conflict. The text does go over 5 political assumptions, one of them being that organizations are subdivided within different groups and different teams, which makes sense because there are different departments within corporations. People have different skill sets. Within that, I'm sure that there's also cliques that are formed through bonds and mutual beliefs and values. The second assumption is that there are lasting distinctions between associates within those subdivisions. So again, they also have different beliefs, information, values, interests, resources, and perceptions of reality. We were all raised differently, so everyone plays a hand in the broader image. The third assumption is that major choices entail distributing limited resources. So every company has a budget. And sometimes there's favoritism when it comes to that. So the way that an organization decides to utilize it is by seeing who plays the political game the best way that they could, by using leverages and their resources and their influence. It goes like the textbook goes over a lot more reasoning behind that later on that I will be going over. And the fourth assumption is that insufficient assets or materials and ongoing distinctness will generate an environment of friction, where, again, everyone will try to leverage their own resources. They will have their own power, whether it's physically, mentally, or through their skill set, or if they have power in numbers. And then the fifth assumption is that objectives and settlements result from bargaining, negotiation, and jockeying for a spot in the company of other collaborators. So I did quote Pfeffer, and he defines power as the potential ability to influence behavior, to change the course of events, to overcome resistance, and to get people to do things that they would not otherwise do. Another thing that I do want to highlight is sociology. Social scientists going over the leverage that people have over other groups when they have certain resources that are wanted or needed. It's the relationship between power and dependency and how you can leverage that to your advantage. 4 relational concepts that also make decisions more manageable are the quasi-resolution conflict. So it's this permitting subgroups to resolve their differences. The second relational concept is uncertainty avoidance. So standardizing the way of doing things by contract, traditions, and procedures. The third relational concept is problemistic search. So coalitions problem solve by finding results in the locality where the problem resides. The fourth one is organizational learning. So evolving objectives and ambitions, reprioritizing through experiences. The text also describes major types of power in organizations. Some are more subtle and less aggressive than others. Some are very direct. So one being authority, coercive power would be the opposite of authority, as coercive power would be something that people utilize in order to influence someone to do something without demanding that they do it. Information and expertise, alliance and networks, reputation, so being able to speak openly to other people and having the leverage of just being believed on the basis of your reputation. And sometimes people just have their own personal power, which isn't really... It could be developed and learned through different experiences, but it isn't something to be transferred over, aside from having the network to have an advantage of someone with power or being that person that lends the power over to someone else. So saying that, that also contributes to the 6 strategic methods to having influence over others, which include having authority, liking, social proof, so having someone to validate that you are who you say you are, or you do what you say you will do, commitment and consistency, reciprocation, the ability to do something kind for someone that is doing something kind for you. In utilizing all of the different methods that I've mentioned, there's also going to be a rising conflict because of animosity or resentment due to knowing how to utilize your resources, your influence, your reputation, your relationships and allies with other members within that organization. Conflicts are usually horizontal, which means that they're within departments and divisions that are at the same level or same skill set, as opposed to vertical conflict, which occurs between different levels of subordinates and higher ups, so within a hierarchy. Moral mazes, so aside from the act of performing a job skill set, it is also important to have interpersonal relationships and creating allies and bonding with people that you work with in order to have influence and credibility, that displays your work ethic. Because if you don't advocate for yourself or you don't speak up, then no one really knows what you're doing. So following up with the different power and conflict dynamics that are within an organization, managers also play a crucial role as politicians that set the tone for where the organization is going and who is benefiting the organization in affirming those objectives and who's opposing them, and possibly negotiating with those individuals or doing something more forceful. So 2 main components for modifications is being sensitive towards other stakeholders' concerns. So you should know what they care about. You should be able to empathize with other individuals and have a plan of action to acknowledge who is working for or against the goal. So to design the political domain as a manager, you have to be able to establish manners of casual communication amongst your colleagues or subordinates. You have to pinpoint primary political influencers, so people that are going to have your back and share the same values and uphold the objective of the company. Explore prospects for propelling internal and external participants. So aside from having alliances within the organization, also being a part of the community, establishing different relationships with other agencies as well that share the same values. And you also have to expect counter strategies that others are likely to implement. So that means being self-aware of who your enemies are. I guess it's going to vary. The levels of contrast are going to vary depending on whether or not you can communicate with your enemies and try to negotiate with them. Though this chapter does go over managers setting up the political arena, I do want to also highlight teams and the importance of influence that they have on upper management, it makes it easier to manage teams when you are perceived as credible, competent, and sensible. It's a two-way street that isn't often recognized. So another crucial skill that managers should have as political agents is bargaining and negotiating. Fisher and Udi proposed an alternative to positional bargaining. They use principal bargaining with 4 approaches. One is to separate people from the problem, as empathy and inquiry are 2 components that will ensue better understanding. So instead of being petty and personally attacking someone for their own separate beliefs, it's trying to humanize the other person and understand if they have the same objective as you and what would their strategy be, and then comparing that to your own. So rather than escalating, de-escalating, so that both people are open to negotiating rather than just being defensive. The second one is to focus on interests, not positions. The third one is to create options for mutual gains. The more alternatives, the better. The fourth one is to be assertive towards nonpartisan standards. Aside from that, there are bargaining procedures and processes that will help benefit managers to practice. The text just describes what bargaining is, the way that interdependent relationships work with one another in order for both parties to achieve their goals, or multiple parties to achieve their goals, and the way that either one could hold power over the other. When bargaining, you're in the process of achieving your goal, so there is no penalties aside from, I guess, the end result, but there is coercion that could be used by using threats, but they need to be credible. So though you could use threats, it's a very tricky game to play, because if you over threaten, then you might not be taken seriously. People might think that you're bluffing. And then if you under threaten, then you are not intimidating anyone, and people will think that they could just walk all over you. So as managers have been described as political trailblazers for different organizations, it's also crucial that they practice morale. So that means that they follow the 4 principles of moral judgments. The first one's mutuality. They're being fair to other people, other organizations within the same settings in the same game. The second one's generality. The third one is openness, so transparency with other groups. Just being shameless about the actions that you're taking, because if you're being or making decisions that are moral, then you wouldn't have anything to hide. And the fourth one is caring. And that wraps up the 10th chapter. Now I'm going to be going over chapter 11, which is organizations as political arenas and political agents. To briefly explain establishments as arenas, performers tend to be interchangeable, so they are variable, while environments tend to be firmer and established systems, so they're fixed. Performers tend to, they could be fired, for example, or laid off, or they might be promoted, or they could transfer to a different location if the organization has multiple locations. Political proportions of operational structures, also described as agreements to the distributions of responsibilities and assets. So, since there are different divisions within an organization that have different skill sets, they require different materials or resources. Origins of political drive. As previously stated by the late Martin Luther King Jr., there is power in unity and there is power in numbers. This rings true in organizations. So although management does tend to be viewed from the top down, sometimes there are enough powers in numbers and unions get involved, and the bottom can influence the top. So inverted political processes, coalitions that emerge from political difference are reflected by revolutions. Obstacles to regulate from the top. Although authoritative figures are looked to for guidance, there may be drawbacks when branches of groups at the lower level don't align well with set objectives. Subdivisions may decide to rebel against initiatives. Institutions as political advocates. Power comes to the organizations that are self-aware and involved in the environment where they're located. The essential plans for respective leaders are to set an objective, survey the locality, so understand what the values are of the community where you're located. Form bonds with collaborators and rivals. So, working well with others that want to reciprocate the same, and also being aware that there is competition and sometimes you won't always have the upper hand, but it's important to know what your competition is doing. This just reminded me of the short video that we watched during our class regarding Apple, Steve Jobs, and Bill Gates, when Bill Gates took an idea of, well, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, I think, just had different upbringings, and they both had great ideas and they fed off of each other. I don't necessarily think that there was any true moral codes that were being broken, just because they kind of played the same game with each other. And to deliberate settlements and affiliations. Organizations have political engagements within multitudes of networks in an ecosystem. This includes governing ecosystems that require transparency in their methodology. So something like the Food and Drug Administration that require transparency when illnesses arise due to regulatory misconduct, due to the fact that they have an obligation to the public. It's important that if there is a regulation that is broken and someone unfortunately gets sick or something bad happens to them, it's important that they go through the proper procedures to implement changes so that it's not done again, or it could be avoided. Corporate government relations that afford leverage to set precedents for local businesses. The text uses insurance companies as an example versus private practice physicians when it comes to administering drugs. One is more affordable than the other, and it's important to be engaged with agencies that do the same processes, just so that the business isn't monopolized by one brand or one company. Complex dynamics within corporations, businesses, governments, and the general public. Understanding the distribution of wealth cycles from the general public to different corporations and back to different government agencies. So understanding the cycles of wealth that occurs, which not a lot of people know about. A lot of people like to shop at big corporations because they are a lot more affordable, since those corporations are purchasing things in masses and they have franchises. But it's important to also shop local, because those taxes actually go back to those mom and pop shops, which goes back into the economy of that neighborhood. So that is something that, like, I will personally mention. I do advocate for supporting local businesses instead of franchises, because it's gonna go back to public education. I mean, I have a daughter in school, so I'm biased when it comes to that. Yeah. So in conclusion, corporations' greatest opportunity to longevity are their relationships with different groups, such as the general public, other businesses, and government agencies. And that explains the political frame. Moving on to the fourth frame, which is the symbolic frame, which is also compared to temples and carnivals. It's nothing like the political frame that is compared to jungles, which is chaotic and competitive as politics is. Temples and carnivals actually helps to give institutions life and meaning, and it refines the space so it isn't an individualized environment. It brings people together, and it brings hope and faith into the lives of associates that work at those corporations. So they play a crucial role in the culture. Chapter 12 goes over the organizational symbols and culture. So I quoted, underlying beliefs that are embedded through symbols using organization theory and sociology, political science, magic, and neurolinguistic programming. So there are 5 notions that the symbolic frame is influenced by. Priorities. So what is important for the culture? Understanding of priorities differentiated from actions through different views. So not putting focus on what the intentions are or what the outcome is, but what gives the company meaning. The benefit of having stories to turn to when people need guidance, motivation, and grounding. Again, sometimes when you've been in a space, either for a short period of time, there's a lot of times that you will not be aware of what to do, and it really helps to have an example to look up to for guidance. And then again, even for people that have been in the same place and have seniority, it also helps cultivate those reminders of why it gives meaning to what you're doing. Like why you're doing what you're doing and why you decided to choose the place where you are employed. I think that stories play a crucial role for newcomers, but I also think that it's underestimated for old timers as well, as I could just see it sparking the joy to be able to share the culture of the company with other people, as people tend to be variable. And when you are the stable individual that stays in the same place, you tend to see everyone else either move up, move away, leave, and just life happens around you, and it helps to share stories and yeah, and be embraced and be understood. I feel like stories are a great way of creating empathy. So ceremonies and traditions are the fourth notion. They're valuable in creating personal acknowledgments and motivating other members in finding their own ambitions. This notion just reminded me of when I used to work for Vans. I worked at two different locations. I transferred from Newport Mall, is where I started, to Newport Mall is in Jersey City, and then I moved over to Soho in Manhattan, New York. The cultures were different, but the atmosphere was the same. Both locations were acknowledged for doing the same work. There were advantages to working in Manhattan, though, because that location carried a line called Vans Vault, so those are more exclusive sneakers. But working at the mall, we shared traditional values of working through Thanksgiving, sacrificing our time, working on Black Friday. We were given cookies from the company, holiday cookies from the company with like the Vans logo on a tin box. It was really nice. It was a nice gesture. And we also received Vans slip-ons. They were holiday slip-ons. So it was rewarding to be able to work for a company that values their employees in whatever way that they can. Aside from that, there was also performance reviews in its own way with sales, but the reward was the ability to work more hours. You would have the privilege of setting your schedule better with the manager, and that was working in New Jersey. But working in Manhattan, we had a couple of events at the store. Since we weren't in a mall, we weren't restricted to a set schedule of hours. We did have a set schedule, but we were also able to have events, and we were also able to let customers in, since it was a location that was mainly populated with tourists. So sometimes tourists wouldn't be aware that we would close at 7, and they would wander in like 2 minutes before closing, but we were still able to attend to them. And the company, again, like the year that I worked at that location was the 50th anniversary. So the company sent over a free pair of authentic Vans. I still have my pair just because it's symbolic to that time period of my life, and it's just nice memorabilia. It's symbolic of that time for me. Aside from that, for the 50th anniversary, they also, since they have the House of Vans, which was located in Williamsburg, I know that they closed it down. I don't know if they relocated it at all, if they reopened it somewhere else, but they did a raffle that was free, where they had a concert with Nas. He was there, and Steve, like, I'm horrible because I forgot, but there was food, there was live music, and it was nice to be in a company that values community and isn't just like they could have easily made everyone pay for a ticket, but Vans has the generous culture of giving back to the community in any which way. So, yeah. Being there, I didn't skate, so I wasn't a part of the skating community. I still don't know how to skate, but it was nice to be in an environment where people were laid back and they had their own goals, and we were able to share our personal goals while still working at the same place and valuing our differences. A fifth notion is that common lifestyles, celebrations, and values enmesh groups in refining the culture of the group. There are different trademarks that cycle through annually and quarterly through corporations. There are stories, icons, and role models, and narratives, which all fall into just sharing information so that there is a collective culture of knowing what are the values, the morals, and how to mediate conflict when they arise. 8 classifications of purpose that Dennings also expresses are getting members to be proactive, expressing identity, expressing the identity of the establishment, so understanding the branding of the company, conveying ethics, promoting cooperation, guiding narratives and controlling rumors, exchanging scholarly information, so not withholding or keeping knowledge to yourself, because helping your peers is helping the company. Encouraging individuals to be inspired, so to look ahead and be inspired to be creative. 2 habitual customs that are listed in the text are indoctrination by rituals. It states that it creates uniformity and shared morals and values through the organization. So something like using the rite of passage, seeing what the values and customs are of newcomers and testing their boundaries and testing their knowledge to see what they know, in order to see if they have enough skin to stay in the game, whether or not they know how to play into the political arena. And the second one is ceremonies as formal occasions that illuminate turning points and milestones. So something like someone celebrating being in a company for 20 years, also being promoted within the company, whether they are staying in the same location or changing locations, as well as retirement parties or onboarding new employees. Although corporations are assumed to be places that just are efficient and productive, it's also important that they also use humor and play, analogies, wittiness, and that amongst colleagues they're able to entertain each other, just so that it could be less rigid and more personable as the day-to-day business days go on. Refinement of the identity of corporations rely on the transformation and unification of senior and rookie members. So like I mentioned before, something like the rite of passage as an onboarding for newcomers, and versus someone with seniority celebrating their 30th year at a company. Both are important. I do want to break down Geert Hofstade's 4 aspects of national culture for a wider comprehension, and why it's important to adapt and integrate into different cultures when working abroad. So, understanding the power difference between subordinates and employers, uncertainty avoidance. So, knowing within that culture just how risky they are, individualism, viewing how independent or interdependent a company is. I know that in Japan, companies are very, I don't know if I would say family oriented. I know that in America, we consider companies that we work amongst sometimes as family. And then sometimes we don't. Sometimes we just consider them as friends. Or sometimes people just consider them as colleagues. It just depends on the work environment that you're in. But in Japan, I recall just knowing that there are certain social expectations. So out of work, if your boss wants to go out for drinks, or your colleagues are more than likely gonna go, and it's a part of the social structure that you adapt to your willingness of being present, even though it isn't work productivity necessarily, it's still a form of bonding. So missing out on company activities plays a role in the politics within that environment. And the last one is masculinity, femininity. So knowing which one is more valued or undervalued. That concluded chapter 12. I'm now going to be going over chapter 13, which is culture in action. Principles to cultivate and assert solidarity with groups and divisions, subdivisions. So keeping in mind how members become a part of the team, maintaining an assortment of individuals. That means different people that have different skill sets and experiences that come from different trials and tribulations of life. As personality wise, you don't really want to have, well, I'm like, you don't really want to have two strong-headed individuals with each other, but at the same time, it's bound to happen. It's just a matter of the way that they learn to function with each other. Exemplifying rather than using intimidation or being demanding. So, in the text, it does kind of speak about using kind of a manipulative tactic in setting goals, even if they're big or small or they can't be really accomplished, but it brings motivation into the environment, and that helps set the culture. Personalizing linguistics of the group. So having your own slang and understanding between team members, where no one else will really understand what you're talking about. It's a form of bonding. Narratives of historical merits and morals. Entertaining through comedy to spark imagination. Traditions and formal occasions inspire, and occasions strengthens principles. Again, it just, the traditions and formal occasions. So traditions, I think about coffee breaks in a corporate setting, or even at a blue collar workplace. They also share those values in their own way. So it might be something like using the corporate card to buy everyone bagels at 9 a.m. or taking a break at 2 p.m., sharing your 15-minute break rather than independently going on your own. And the last principle shared is casual cultural collaborators. They tend to excessively provide to their position. So it made me think about the personality hires that uplift spirits. I wouldn't say that I've been that person because I'm a very organized individual, but I do recall taking on just emotional baggage sometimes when I'm not responsible for that. I recall working at the eyewear store, Cleonici, as I started off as a sales associate, but I eventually ended up with the title lead sales manager. My pay grade did not go up. I just managed to make more money through tips. It gave me credibility. So I recall having a shift with someone that came into the workplace distressed, and I asked him to go for a walk and to come back level-headed so that we can talk, because mental health has always been an important thing for me. He informed me that he had a lot of personal problems that he was worried about, so I let him go home for the day to take care of his mental health. I covered the shift at the boutique by myself, and I could sense the level of respect that I earned from just being understanding to his needs at that moment. It didn't bring us any closer because I wasn't going to intrude into his personal life, but sometimes people just need to be reminded to take care of themselves. We get caught up in productivity and forget that we are human and that we also need to take care of ourselves. So lastly, the last principle is the embodiment. Essence and soul are the source to success. So being able to cultivate a coherent and shared culture and knowing how to work through conflict with individuals, using stories and heroism and virtues sets the tone and the grounds and the fundamentals to any environment. So since we completed chapter 13, I'm now going to go over chapter 14, which is organization as theater. It just goes over how organizations market themselves, the illusions casted for the audience, and their perception of that narration. Dramaturgical and institutional theory. Paul J. DiMaggio and Walter Powell explain 3 forms of isomorphism. One is coercive, which means that outside pressures influence change. 2 is mimetic, meaning that businesses imitate other businesses as a temporary fix. And normative. So social governing structures influence professions involved in law, medicine, and education, for example. The text does go into description on normative more, using the setting of a medical hospital, what the expectations would be, the long tissue paper being, recently changed out, sanitary regulations being implemented, doctors walking around in scrubs. These are social expectations that we have just from being consistently exposed to those procedures. Implementing dramaturgical aspects are useful in organizational settings just to perform as a structure, as there are a lot of downtimes when companies are already established and have the foundation and routines completed. It is a great way to keep team members motivated and feeling like they are being productive within their environment. So one of them is setting meetings for people to collaborate and evaluate where the company is and where each individual stands. Strategizing. Cohen and March detail the metaphorical roles that strategic planning plays. So, the way that plans are symbols or metaphors for development. Plans can become games. They exemplify commitment and ambition. They encourage reasonable action to socialize and collaborate with other individuals or other divisions within that company. Plans become a strategic way of marketing organizations as well. If someone within that corporation feels that certain changes need to be implemented, it gives them reason to do more research and to collaborate with other individuals or other companies for those changes to be first reviewed and then move on from there. It isn't an immediate thing that is done. That's why it's a little bit more performative, as one person might have a request, another person can say why and what is the proof or research that you did. And yeah, another implementation of dramaturgical aspects is analyzing, collaborative bargaining, and negotiating. So although when we think about unions bargaining, there is a platform for them to go back and forth, but also behind closed doors, there's also set agreements to those differences. This actually made me think of this previous year, the Department of Education, a majority of UFT members wanted to have the extra day off, I believe, for the winter break. And it took a bit for them to get their day, but it was established and UFT won. I'm not sure what is the backstory behind it, but it gives acknowledgement to those employees that they are important, they fought for something that they believed in, and they were able to accomplish it as a union, as a group, and that forms a bond between them. Another one is authority and influence. So although we like to think that authority comes from the top to bottom, authority really comes sometimes from within. The way that somebody carries themselves, even if they don't have any authority. I've definitely seen people in different settings that have kind of lied about their positions. Sometimes there are paraprofessionals that work in a school setting and they're not necessarily in a classroom, but they might help somewhere else. And they'll lie and say that they're a teacher even though they're not. But students will buy into it because of the authority that they hold over them. And then conveying an image is the last one that is listed. So, in conclusion, sometimes there are moments where corporations aren't as productive as they are. It's an illusion or a narrative that we like to believe as a society. But mindsets are important, and sometimes those illusions are important too, to feel like we're doing something to have a sense of fulfillment, and also to help people bond and feel like they are being productive. So that is the end of the symbolic frame. This is the end of the political and the symbolic frame. If you want to follow up, you can just subscribe. I'm gonna be making another video on leadership practices. So thank you for sticking around and watching my video throughout this whole time. Take care.